Stephen Hand from the Staccato School of Defence. A little while ago I did a video on Sweetnam's 12-foot rapier lunge, and I talked a little bit about rapier lengths in it. I want to talk about rapier lengths again, and I want to do it particularly in reference to the Elizabethan fencing master Vincentio Saviolo. Saviolo was really the man who prompted Silva to write Paradoxes of Defence. He was an Italian rapier master from Padua who arrived in England around 1589 and taught, as Silva said, for 7 or 8 years before he died. We're not sure how he died, but we can be pretty sure he didn't die from an English sword, because Silva could not have contained himself with delight at telling us about it had he been killed by an Englishman. So he probably died of something like the plague or scrofula or one of those fun things. Silva, in Paradoxes of Defence, in Paradox 3, he writes criticising Italian rapier fencing. And a couple of the things he says is their weapons are most commonly too long to uncross without going back with their feet, and their weapons are most commonly too heavy both to defend and offend in due time. Now, I'm mostly going to be talking about length, but I just want to touch on that idea of weight. A lot of people still refer to rapiers as light weapons. They were not light. My colleague Paul Wagner, in his book Master of Defence, analysed 186 rapiers from the 1590s, and he found that the average blade length was 41.5 inches or 105 centimetres, and he found that the average weight was over 3 pounds, 3.1 pounds or 1.4 kilograms. That's a big heavy weapon. It's heavier than a medieval arming sword. So, English rapiers were long and they were heavy. So, what did Silva write about? Something else that he wrote about, he said, "Whatsoever they teach is both true and false. True in their demonstrations according with their force and time in gentle play, and in their actions according with true force and time in rough play or fight, false." So what he's saying there is basically that when they're practising in the fencing school, obviously in a little bit slower tempo than they would in a real fight, then everything works. When they go out and do it for real, in a real fight, it doesn't work. It breaks down under pressure. So what evidence do we have that's either support or deny what Silva said? I think that here at Staccato we are in a fairly unique position in terms of studying the rapier fencing of Vincentio Saviolo. When we started out, we came from a historical reenactment background, and we started out doing rapier fencing almost as reenactors. We wore historical clothing, we wore leather buff coats as protection. We did not wear fencing masks because they didn't have fencing masks. Now that seems like a pretty dumb idea. Back then it seemed to make perfect sense. So for quite a few years, from probably about 1993 through to 2000, I learned and taught Saviolo without fencing masks, without the face as a target, and indeed without tips on the end of the rapier. And it worked really, really well. We tended to use long rapiers. So we tended to use long rapiers like the one that I showed you before that I use for Sweetnam. And indeed, using this rapier, I won a major tournament in the US in 2001 using the techniques of Vincentio Saviolo. So it does work. However, when I came back from my first trip to the US and I said, look guys, we really have to start wearing fencing masks. We are the odd people out. What happened when we started wearing fencing masks is some of the techniques started to break down. Not drastically so, but they started to break down just a little bit in timing. The timing was a little bit off, the distance was a little bit off, and techniques didn't work as well as they had. So does this mean that Silva was absolutely right, that it works in gentle play in the Sal? right? Working without masks, working without tips, where you have to be a little bit careful, and it doesn't work when you're fighting harder and faster with masks and with tips on your rapier. Well, yes and no. This rapier has a 42-inch blade. It's very close to those statistics that Paul collected, the average of 186 English rapiers from the 1590s. Now, we don't know what length of rapier Saviolo suggested. In fact, one of the criticisms Silver makes of Italian rapier masters, for which read Saviolo, is that they don't lay down perfect lengths for their weapons. So we can be fairly certain that people were using weapons of this sort of length to do Saviolo's techniques. But what sort of weapon was Saviolo using? Well, to do that, we have to go and look at the sort of fencing Saviolo was doing. The first time I went to the US, I'd been doing Saviolo for 7 years. And the moment I got there, I started doing a class on Saviolo in front of some students of Ramon Martinez, who was at that stage the world's foremost authority on Spanish rapier fencing. And this guy suddenly exclaimed, "That's Spanish." And I said, "Well, is it? I don't know. I've never seen Spanish rapier fencing." This culminated in Ramon Martinez and I writing a paper which was published in Sparta, the Journal of the Swordplay Symposium International, in 2003, in which we examined the evidence, and I think there's considerable evidence that Saviolo was at least in part based on Spanish rapier fencing. And if we look at Spanish rapier fencing, they lay down quite a few ways of measuring the perfect length of your weapon. The one that I find most useful is where you put the end of the hilt, the end of the pommel on next to one shoulder, and you reach your fingers out, and the tip of the rapier should be exactly equal with the end of the fingers of your outstretched hand. Now, as we can see here, that's not the case. This is about 2 to 3 inches, 5 to 8 centimetres too long. If I get another weapon, this is a particularly nice piece made for me some years ago by Arms and Armour, which I can highly recommend. It's based on an original in the Wallace collection. If I do the measurement there, lo and behold, it's exactly the right measurement for that Spanish measurement. And if I compare that with my sword of Silver's perfect length, then I will find, if I match them up, that it's actually not too dissimilar. It's only about an inch and a half away from being Silver's perfect length. Okay, so a little bit longer than Silver's perfect length. When I started doing Saviolo's rapier techniques with this length of rapier, all of a sudden, however hard I wanted to go, they started working again. So, this is an example where using a weapon that's just a little bit too long, a little bit unlike the weapon that you should be using, the techniques start to not work. It's not a drastic thing where one day they work, the next day they just don't work at all. It's just they don't work quite as nicely when you go hard with a long rapier. You can go as hard as you like with a shorter rapier and the techniques work just fine. So, what's our conclusion? Silver said that Italian rapier fencing worked in general play in the saddle and didn't work in rough play or real fight out on the street. And I believe he was entirely correct in saying that, because the average person doing Saviolo's system would probably have been using a long English rapier. Now, what does that say about Saviolo? Was Saviolo's system flawed? Well, no, because if you use a shorter rapier, then it works. Was Saviolo a fraud? Was he telling people to do stuff that he knew wasn't going to work when they actually went out to fight? Maybe. I would like to think he was a little more honest than that. I would like to think that he suggested to people that they should have a weapon length that was his perfect length, and knowing what the average Englishman is like, just as likely they probably said, no, get stuffed, we're going to use our rapiers that we've already bought, and it just teaches the techniques. Yeah, they seem to work all right. So, Silva was right, Saviolo was right, the Englishmen who were doing Saviolo were almost certainly wrong, and a good number of them, if you believe Silva, got themselves killed by doing Saviolo with a weapon that wasn't suited to the system. Thanks for watching.